Many countries are saying the campaign has gone too far, but to what degree should international forces get involved in order to protect civilians?
Well, they say it's a NATO operation. Turkey is expressing a lot of reservations, and as to whether it's gone too far, I think we can bet that there are already SAS and other forces on the ground. And as for a NATO, which is somehow European compared to US-led in terms of this mission, I think it's absurd. The United States, of course, is still behind it, even though Robert Gates and so on had a lot of reservations about it. But I think another aspect of this, and we know the fighting is going on and the bombing is going on, another aspect of this is that there are reports here that depleted uranium is being used. And when the Americans used that in Fallujah, 10 years later, or years later, birth defects were being discovered at 5 times the normal rate. So let's hope that that's not another consequence of this Allied bombing.
Well, whatever military action has been taken, the US Defense Secretary Robert Gates says that this international action we're seeing now appears to be achieving success, and we're reporting now that the rebels are indeed gaining ground. So he is right. This initiative is actually working, isn't it?
But how is it working? Who is it working for? It's very interesting that, of course, there were 5 abstentions for UN Resolution 1973. The Russian Prime Minister and President making sounds about this mission, Beijing being a bit more wary. And what happened to the African Union? Do we just not care about them? Because they unanimously didn't want what is going on now. As for the Arab League, a very, very iffy support for this, although...
But they are supporting it, aren't they?
As well.
Sorry, the Arab League, that is significant, the fact that they are supporting this action and endorsing what NATO is going to carry on doing and completing the military action, taking over the command of the military action. They are supporting that, aren't they?
Well, it's a win-win, isn't it? Because the autocrats who are in power, the dictators who are in the Arab League, can now blame the protests in their own countries on Zionist American conspiracies, because after all, didn't they come to help the protests in Libya? Also, they get to topple a dictator that hasn't been good to them, because he's always looked to Africa.
But what do you make of the slight wobble we saw a little earlier from the Arab League earlier last week? We're getting mixed messages from them, aren't we, at the moment?
Well, Amon Musa certainly wanted it both ways. You won't see any Tunisian or Egyptian help for this NATO operation at all. I think that question needs to be answered by all these NATO leaders. They're meeting in London here on Tuesday, the foreign secretaries, foreign ministers of these countries. Why do you think Tunisia and Egypt aren't involved? Because they see a great danger of Western powers trying to get involved with this oil-rich nation, because let's face it, a lot of spoils to be won, and all those tanks and all those military equipment will need to be sold to whoever wins in the future. We can talk about that later. And of course, there's all-important oil supplies. There's 1.5 million barrels of oil a day.
Let's talk about the future now. The end game to all of this, if Gaddafi is removed, what next? How likely is it that we will actually see a smooth transition to a democratic state?
I think there's no doubt the Western powers want a strong man in power so that the oil resources and oil contracts and military contracts and so forth can be arranged the way the Western powers and the big multinationals want them to be. Also, Gaddafi put a lot of investment in African countries. I'm sure the petrodollars will be much more appreciated on equity markets in Wall Street and the City of London and who knows, Frankfurt, because the end game is not some amazing democratic outcome if they want to nationalize the oil, keep the oil nationalized and renege on existing contracts. Libya, a very complicated country, different tribes held together, different communities in East and West. What happens then? I think serious questions have to be asked. I'm sure that there are people on the ground in the coalition from Western agencies already planning the future and what the future government will be. I fear it won't be the kind of democracy that we saw in the natural revolutions, as it were, in Tunisia and Egypt.
Could we finally look at the wider region now, what's happening beyond Libya? Yemen, Syria and Bahrain, obviously we're seeing instability there, but we are seeing conciliatory gestures from the leaders promising reform and extra freedom for its people, or their people. Is that too little too late? After all, we've seen the Yemen president saying that he will step down, but what is the situation in those countries, do you think? Similar to that what we're seeing in Libya?
It's unbelievable that the United States supported President Saleh when he was so close to al-Qaeda all those times. They trained, British and American troops trained Yemeni forces to kill off Shias in the northwest of Yemen. As for other countries, Bahrain, you won't get much news about that in many of the media because, of course, the Fifth Fleet is there and Saudi troops are now occupying in Bahrain. And now, as I said, autocrats, dictators, they can all say, we have to crack down on these protests because, look, the Americans, along with no doubt the Israelis, will have their own agents amongst the protesters, and they can now use that. This mission in Libya, the West will learn to live the consequences for years to come, whether it be increased levels of militancy, hijackings, and so forth. And it's a grave mistake.
Afshin Rattansi, good to hear your view of the events there in Libya and beyond. Thanks very much indeed for joining us live here on RT.